ever unexpectedly lost your job and then had your lease about to expire, and because you lost your job, had to potentially move out of state? Oh, maybe that's just me. Hopefully it is just me, but chances are it probably isn't just me, and you're probably going to come against some unexpected loss or emergency that happens in your life. And in this video, I'm going to explain to you the importance of having an emergency fund. Hi, I'm Shayna of the Wealth Vibe, and I create videos to help you eliminate debt, grow your income, and build your wealth. And in this video, I'm going to talk all about emergency funds and why it's so important to have an emergency fund and how you can go about getting your emergency fund started and funded so you don't have to deal with unexpected emergencies like I have had to deal with in the recent past. If you've ever been in an emergency and had no money to rely on, and you had to figure out how you were going to survive this emergency, make sure that you share this video to other people so that they don't have to go through the same type of loss that you and I have had to experience. But if you are one of those people who has been fortunate enough not to have to experience an emergency, or has had money set aside, or maybe even a family member that has been able to help you out in the past with emergencies, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up so that other people know how important it is to have an emergency fund set up. So go ahead and give that video a share or a thumbs up, and then we'll get straight into the video. So let's cover the basics of what an emergency fund is. An emergency fund is a set of money or an account that you have that allows you to weather any financial dilemma, such as a future mishap or an unexpected expense. And some financial dilemmas that can happen in your life are an unexpected job loss, a debilitating medical illness, or a catastrophic event like a hurricane or tornado that affects you personally. And it's really important to have an emergency fund because an emergency fund allows you to have some peace over your life while those emergencies are happening so that you can cover them without any problems. You don't have to rely on your mom, your dad, your boyfriend, girlfriend, sister, cousin, or anybody else, or even high interest credit card debt or personal loans. You can just reach into your own set of money that you have saved up to be able to weather those financial issues whenever they come. So you might be wondering what qualifies as an emergency. And so I have 3 guidelines for what qualifies as an emergency and something that you can think of whenever you're faced with an unexpected event that you're like, okay, can I dip into my emergency fund for this at this point? So you can think about, is it unexpected? Is it necessary? And is it urgent? And so if you can answer yes to more of those questions, then it potentially is an emergency and is a reason why you can safely go into your emergency fund to cover that expense. So let me give you an example. So let's say you are in your house and all of a sudden a tree falls onto your roof. So is it an emergency? Well, it is unexpected because you didn't go cut the tree down, right? I hope you didn't. And then secondly, is it necessary to get your roof fixed? Yes, it is, because if it starts raining, your entire house is going to get flooded. All types of bugs and creatures are going to come into your house, and you definitely don't want that to happen. And is it urgent? Yeah, because you don't want, like I said, bugs and creatures or rain flooding out your house. So it's super important. So I would say that if a tree fell on your house, that is definitely an emergency. So here's a situation that you might be wondering whether it's an emergency or not. So let's say you filed your taxes last year, and when you filed, you had no money owed to the federal government. And you filed your taxes, and then later on, the federal government sends you a notice saying that you owe them $1,500 in back taxes. So let's go through the criteria to determine whether or not it's an emergency. So 1, was it unexpected? Yeah, it was unexpected because you thought you didn't owe them anything, right? So it's definitely unexpected. Now 2, is it necessary? Is it necessary that you pay the federal government their back taxes? I would say yes, you gotta pay them, right? So that's 2 out of 3. So now 3, here is where I think it gets a little gray. Is it urgent that you pay them immediately once you get the notice? If you don't have the money, I would say it's not urgent to pay them at that moment if you have to consider paying it with a high interest credit card or a personal loan that you don't have access to that money right away to pay off. And the reason why I say it's not urgent is because the federal government tends to have installment plans where if you do owe back taxes, you can just pay them back over a period of time in smaller chunks of money. So in my opinion, because it was unexpected and necessary but not urgent, that's not really an emergency or reason to go into your emergency fund. There are a few benefits of having an emergency fund. So 1, it allows you to handle emergency situations with confidence, and you don't have to have as much stress as you potentially would if you didn't have that emergency fund set aside for you. Can you imagine like what kind of chaos or what kind of emotions you would be feeling if you didn't have an emergency fund or any money set aside if you unexpectedly had to pay $15,000 maybe to cover a unexpected medical emergency or something like that? If you have that money set aside, you can easily, maybe not easily because we're talking about $15,000 here, but you can know, you have some confidence that you have the money there that you can reach for and it doesn't make a huge financial impact on your life. An emergency fund also helps you with spending. So without an emergency fund, people tend to spend all the money that they earn. They spend up everything buying all the Gucci bags, all the Chanel's, all the Jordans, all the Benzes and all that. And I've been there. I spent all my money. If you're interested in seeing all the financial mistakes that I've ever made, go ahead and check out the video linked up in the cards above. But with an emergency fund, you have the confidence in knowing that you have money set aside. So the money that you do have remaining in your paychecks after you cover your housing and all those other important expenses, you know that you can actually freely spend that money on whatever you want, or you can choose to, what I tend to suggest is to pay off debt or to invest. And you can make those decisions confidently and not have to worry about, am I spending too much money that I actually don't have? Am I spending money on things that I cannot afford? But if you have an emergency fund there, you know that you are making good financial decisions. And along with that, it allows you to make great financial decisions in times of emergencies. Because one thing that people tend to rely on in emergencies is their credit cards or getting a personal loan, or even, like I said, borrowing from a family member. And those might be bad financial decisions. Well, for sure, using a credit card or a personal loan can be a really bad decision because there are tons of interest fees, penalties, and all types of things that you have to pay in excess of the money that you borrowed that you don't want to have to pay back, right? So you want to avoid those at all costs. And then especially when you have to borrow from family and friends, it could potentially ruin the relationships that you have with those people. So it allows you to make good financial decisions that don't wreak havoc on your finances anymore, or even on your personal relationships. So this is alarming news that 40% of Americans actually do not have enough money to cover a $400 expense without going into debt. And that's really sad, and I don't want that to be you. So we're going to talk about how much money should be in your emergency fund. So financial experts like to say that you should typically have about 3 to 6 months of income or expenses saved aside for emergencies. So you might be wondering, should I have 3 to 6 months of income or 3 to 6 months of expenses? And I would say either one is fine, because having some money is better than having zero. So I would start probably with expenses if you want to figure out a good goal for your emergency fund. So I would start with expenses, because your expenses, ideally, if you're doing a budget, and if you don't know how to do a budget, make sure that you check out the video that I have linked up here in the cards on how to do a budget. So if you're doing a budget, ideally your expenses are lower than your actual income. That's how it should be if you're doing a budget. And if you're not doing a budget, you need to get on a budget so that you can ensure that your expenses are lower than your income. So that tends to be a smaller and manageable amount of money that people can shoot for. And then I would say after you've gotten 3 to 6 months of expenses saved up, then you can maybe move towards having 3 to 6 months of income. If you have ever listened to, watched, or read any type of financial content on the internet, you probably have come across Dave Ramsey. And I have a personal issue with Dave Ramsey's emergency fund guidelines. So Dave Ramsey talks about 2 different types of emergency funds. He talks about your starter emergency fund, which is baby step number 1. And then later, after you've paid off debt, he recommends that you build up to a regular 3 to 6 month of expenses emergency fund. So my issue comes in with the starter emergency fund, because that is typically what people who are paying off debt tend to rely on when they are following the Dave Ramsey baby steps principle and they come against an emergency. So Dave Ramsey's starter emergency fund guideline is that you have $1,000 as a starter emergency fund. And being as a person who has come across a major financial loss recently and has been paying off debt, I paid off about 50% of the $108,000 debt that I had. If I only had a $1,000 emergency fund or starter emergency fund at this point in time, I would be in a horrible position. So what I actually recommend is that you actually take something from Dave Ramsey himself and use that as the basis for your starter emergency fund. So Dave Ramsey recommends, or he talks about the 4 walls principle. So your 4 walls, according to Dave Ramsey, is your housing, your transportation, your food, and utilities. And in my mind, that is what you should use as your starting point for developing a starter emergency fund. So for the typical person, a $1,000 starter emergency fund is not going to cover your 4 walls. It just isn't. I know for me, my rent, it costs about $1,300. So I wouldn't be able to pay my rent for 1 month in an emergency because my starter emergency fund was $1,000. So I don't recommend it. It makes no sense, especially in these times where rents are increasing, where cost of a living is just so much more money. $1,000 is just unrealistic. So if you are trying to figure out your starter emergency fund, I suggest that you sit down with your budget and you figure out how much does your housing cost? How much does your transportation cost? How much does your utilities and your food cost? And you write down that number, and that's the number that you should shoot for your starter emergency fund. So where does your emergency fund fit into your entire financial goals? It really should be one of the first things that you tackle. So like I said, sit down and figure out what your 4 walls are on a monthly basis, and figure out for 1 month how much you need to have to cover your housing, food, transportation, and utilities. And you start off with that amount in your starter emergency fund. So that should be the first thing that you do whenever you get a new job, or you decide that you're going to be on your financial journey, or you come into some money, whatever it may be, and you are inspired to go on a financial journey to get your personal finances in shape. That's the first thing that you need to do, is figure out what your starter emergency fund is. And then afterward, you want to tackle your high interest debt. So your student loans, your consumer debt like credit cards, personal loans, your car. You want to figure out all that stuff first or second, and then move on to building up your emergency fund to be 3 to 6 months of expenses first, and then of income. So that's where it should really fit in. That way, at any point throughout your financial journey, you have some money. It may not be all the money that you need, but you have some money that you can tap into in case of an emergency. And if you follow my principles, that will at least allow you to get through 1 month of a job loss. 1 month of an unexpected job loss, where you have time to figure out how you're gonna get another job, or tap into another side hustle, perhaps Grubhub or Instacart, or one of the many side hustles that I tend to talk about on this channel. So how do you save up an emergency fund? So let's say you figured out what your starter emergency fund number is. Maybe it's $1,500, and maybe you only make $1,500 a month, and you're thinking like, how am I going to be able to save $1,500 up for my emergency fund? Like, I'm not going to be able to have ends meet. So here's what you do. You need to budget. You need to budget. And once again, if you have not checked out how to budget, my video on that, remember to check it out in the cards. It'll also be linked at the end of this video or linked in the description box. You need to figure out your budget, so that way you can see how much you need to spend on a monthly basis to cover all of your fixed expenses. So like your housing, your transportation, your utilities, and all those things. And then you can see what extra money you have left over. And then you can set aside a certain amount. So people tend to talk about saving 10% of your income. And I think that's a great goal to reach towards, but sometimes 10% is just too much for where you are in your financial situation at this point. So I would say if it's $5, if it's $1, whatever it is, that's where you want to start. If you have any little bit of money left over after your budget, that's the money that you want to set aside for your emergency fund. Now, something else that you can utilize is your tax refunds. So if you are lucky enough to, or I won't say lucky enough because there's a whole debate about whether or not you should be getting a tax refund or if you shouldn't. But if you do have a tax refund, that is a great opportunity for you to save up your entire starter emergency fund, or even maybe your fully funded emergency fund, depending on what that may mean for you. So if you happen to be getting a tax refund, that is a good way of spending your tax refund. Instead of going out and buying a new car or the Gucci's, the Louis, and all that, go ahead and put that money aside for your emergency fund. Another way that you can save for an emergency fund is if you are paid on a bi-weekly basis. So if you are paid on a bi-weekly basis, you actually tend to have a few months through the year where you get a third paycheck. So if you come across that month where you get a third paycheck, that's the time where you take that paycheck, that whole paycheck, and you set that aside for your starter emergency fund or your fully funded emergency fund. Because ideally, if you've been doing a budget, you can cover all your expenses with the first 2 paychecks. You don't really need that third paycheck to be able to get by. So those are 3 ways that you can get started with your emergency fund. I've been talking all about the importance of having an emergency fund and how much money you should have in your emergency fund. And you might have decided, okay, I really need to have an emergency fund because I'm not trying to be caught out here in these streets just out in an emergency with no money. And so you decided, okay, I need to do this. But you might be wondering, where do I put the money? Where do I actually save this money? And what I highly suggest, the key point, is that you need to save your emergency fund in a high yield interest account. So that could be a savings account, a cash account, or a money market account. And I'll do another video that goes over the differences between those accounts. But the key point is that you want a high yield interest account. And you'll want to look for any one of those 3 terms. And a high yield interest account will give you, especially at these times, at least a 2% interest rate. And really, like nowadays, like that's just so easy to come by. There are banks out there giving upwards to 2.7% interest rates on their accounts. And you'll want to check out, especially some of these online banks like Capital One 360 or Markets by Goldman Sachs or CIT Bank. And they will have those interest rates that will allow you to weather inflation. So if you haven't started your emergency fund yet and you're looking for a place to put your emergency fund money in, I have a link down in the description box for Capital One 360. Is a bank that I've been banking with for forever. Before they were even named Capital One 360, they were called ING Direct, and I was with them, so I was with them since the merger. I love that bank, and it's a great place to put your money because they do give you a high interest rate on their savings and their money market accounts. And if you use my link down in the description box, you can actually start an account with them and they'll give you $25. So you have a $25 head start when you use the link down in the description box for your emergency fund. Like, that's just a win-win. But like I said, the key point is that you want an account for your emergency fund that has at least a 2% interest rate on it. And there are tons of banks out there for you to find that will give you just that, because it will allow you to weather inflation. And it's so important to weather inflation because let's say you are fortunate enough, and I hope this is you are fortunate enough to go years, even decades without an emergency that happens to you. And so if you have, let's say, $15,000 for your emergency fund and you go a decade without having to actually tap into that money, one of the good things is, yeah, you have $15,000, but one of the bad things is because of inflation, that means the rising cost of living, that money that you have, the $15,000, 10 years from now is not actually really worth $10,000. It's worth actually much less because things cost more at that point. So you want to make sure that you have an account that is giving you at least 2%, which is kind of, people say 2 to 3% is the going rate of inflation. So you want to make sure that you have an account that at least is keeping pace with inflation, so that the money that you actually have in your account actually has the buying power that you really need in that account. Okay, so if you made it through this entire video and you don't have an emergency fund, not even like $5 or anything to start an emergency fund, you need to get on it. You need to get on it. And the way that you're going to get on it is by checking out these videos here that I have that explain how to do your budget and how to go about some of these financial goals that's going to set you up for success, so that you don't have to experience the stress that comes with dealing with an emergency. So I appreciate you for watching, and if you haven't shared this video or given it a like, make sure that you do that so that everyone knows how important it is to have an emergency fund. And I hope to catch you in the next video. Bye.